that we work with every year. Approximately 10% is what is called core funding. Now, core funding is also known as unearmarked, which is money going to our core mandate of standing to the side of government and working together with them. That is under pressure, but that process has been going on for decades already. Look, in a broader sense, what is called ODA, or Official Development Assistance, over the past years, approximately 1/3 has disappeared. So yes, this will have an impact, but that means that public funding really needs to be used to those locations where it has the most impact and where it is the only way of financing. There's plenty of things where actually, thanks to technological evolution, thanks to market functioning, that used to be financed with public money that today actually are commercially viable. For example, many of the investments today in renewable energy is today commercially viable. And we should then use public money just to do the basic infrastructure, or create the legal framework, or create the banking system. But for example, today, photovoltaic cells are perfectly viable throughout the world. So where we allocate public money needs to be in those framework investments that then create an environment where private investment can take place. So yes, I see the impact on public funding, but that does not mean that other types of funding couldn't play their role.
And you think there are still other types of funding to chase? You talk about new partners in finance and the private sector, but I heard Achim Steiner talk about that. I heard Helen Clark talk about that. I interviewed both your predecessors. There's more money out there?
Well, there is, but we should not think about private investment in a naive way. I mean, the private sector will invest when there's a return, or where it can reduce its risks. And that's perfectly normal. I mean, I have absolutely no problem with the fact that private investment is looking for a certain level of profitability. And looking at financial flows throughout the world, I mean, public investment plays a role, but foreign direct investment actually has played a much more important role. Domestic resource mobilization, which is basically justified taxation, plays a very important role, and remittances, which is basically people who work in the Western world and send money back to their families. I mean, the volume of remittances is today already 3 times bigger than official development assistance. So let's look at it in a broad sense, and let's also not forget what we have achieved. I mean, if you look at the last decades, child mortality has halved. The level of scholarity has been multiplied with 3. HIV infections have decreased in a dramatic way. We have reduced extreme poverty with half over the past 20 years. So the development world can show results. What is important now is that we continue in that flow, and that we continue to innovate, and that we find other sources of financing. But the results are there. There's a lot of criticism to multilateralism. There's some criticism to the development world, and some of that criticism, we have to take it serious. We have to be more efficient. We have to be faster. We have to be more present at those locations where we make the difference. But let's also not shy away from the results that we have achieved and put those results at the table and say, look at what we are capable of. Investment in development is today the smartest investment that you can do. Even for donor countries, this is smart investment from a humanity point of view, but even if only self-interest is what you're looking for, I mean, from the perspective of creating more trade, from the perspective of better managing migration, from the perspective of countering illegal drug trade, investment in development is a smart thing to do. What should be my assignment is to make sure that in the worldwide debate of today, where that debate is being dominated by security issues, is being dominated by migration, by other topics, all those topics are legitimate discussions, but they're symptom discussions. They're symptoms of something underlying. And the thing underlying is very often extreme precarity, inequality, lack of opportunity. That's what development tries to tackle. And so development should be part of that worldwide debate. It's not the case today, but it's my assignment that when we are discussing extremism, migration, security, development is part of that discussion.
Because it's not normally, UNDP, a headline-grabbing part of the UN or seen as the most exciting part of the UN. I suppose you're going to try and change that. You work in 170 different countries and territories. UNDP sometimes to be described to me as the senior service of the UN because you provide an operational backbone for the UN system, for 70 different UN entities. Can you keep that footprint with your new budget?
Yes, you can, because that footprint is to the service of many others. So that footprint is very often used by other UN agencies. And we see that today there's often duplication on the local level. I mean, the UN needs to go in the direction of having a few organizations have a local footprint, but there are also a platform for others to use it. And I mean, we are not there to just serve the UN system. We are there also to work together with other organizations. So the question is not so much related to what footprint does UNDP have. The question is what footprint does the UN system have in general. And the question of development, I mean, development today is not about needs for development in, let's say, fragile circumstances or in least developed countries. I mean, you could basically say that almost all countries in the world today are facing development issues, and very often development issues which they cannot solve on their own. I mean, fighting climate change is something that all countries throughout the world are confronted with. All of us are. Tackling that is something no one can do on their own. They have to do together, and organizations such as UNDP can be used to federate that effort and make sure that, that we work in a complementary way one with another.
You talk about fighting climate change. One of your first meetings in your new job, I believe, was with the SIDS group of countries, the small island developing states. How do you bridge the divide on the idea of climate? On one side, you have these countries that scientists say might be submerged under the ocean and not exist. And then you have the leader of the most powerful nation on earth saying it's the greatest con job ever perpetrated on the world, a hoax and a scam.
Look, I can, when in doubt, I would say trust science. And science is very clear on the fact that climate change is real, that it is provoked by, predominantly by human activity. But science also shows that it's perfectly feasible to reduce the emissions. It's not that today we're waiting for some miraculous solution falling out of the sky. I mean, all the pieces of the puzzle are on the table. And they're actually becoming more affordable than ever. And in some domains, we are lagging. I mean, if you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, approximately 2/3 of the Sustainable Development Goals are or stalled or in delay compared to the schedule. So we have to catch up on that. But in some domains, we're actually ahead of the curve. I talked about photovoltaic cells. Actually, they're cheaper than anyone would have imagined 10 years ago. The adoption of electric vehicles, of EVs, is actually going faster than expected. So there's domains where we overachieve, but unfortunately, there's today many domains where we are slower than we should be.
Do you worry about the fact that the UN has to walk on eggshells not to upset the Trump administration? You mentioned the Sustainable Development Goals. Well, they're all about collective global action. That's not America first, is it?
Well, look, the United Nations has the assignment to bring people around the table. And to bring people around the table who sometimes have different opinions. And you know, this is a free world. Who am I to judge on the opinions that the member states have? I will work together with the ones who believe that working together actually has an impact. There is today way more countries that believe in multilateralism than there are countries that are skeptical on multilateralism. The issue is that today the ones who are skeptical are very loud. The ones who believe in multilateralism are actually way too quiet. And so countries who believe that you're better off in working together, and there's a lot of these, well, they should rally together and they should try to achieve as much as possible. And I'll be open to work with any member states and to understand that in the world of today, many countries look at their self-interests. There's nothing wrong with looking at your self-interests. Not at all. I mean, the world has changed. The United Nations need to change as well. But our mandate is still the same. If I look at UNDP, my mandate is eradicating poverty, protecting people, and protecting planet. The world has changed. The mandate is still the same. The methods we should be using to achieve that mandate need to change together with a changing world.
In the next year, you are going to have a new boss. That's a certainty, because the current Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, his term ends at the end of 2026. Is there any excuse, in your view, as someone who was very close to the UN as a political leader, and now for a few days a UN insider, any excuse not to have the next woman, after 9 men in a row, the next SG to be a woman? And before you answer, I think it's worth telling the audience here, you wrote a book, The Age of Women, Why Feminism Also Liberates Men.
I can only recommend everyone that book. And thank you for the commercial here. Look, a few elements. First of all, the selection of the new Secretary General is a selection made by the member states.
Of course.
Not by the leader of UNDP or any other agencies. What is important is that at least let's start with making sure that the selection basis, let's look at like the candidates or people who put themselves forward as candidates, that list of candidates is not just a list of men. And I've seen that too often, even in national politics, when you say, you know, give me a short list of candidates, very often you would get a short list of, out of 10 candidates, you would get 9 men and only 1 woman. And so pushing for having a more broad list of candidates, I think is a first element. Then, you know, in national politics, before becoming prime minister, the prime minister before me was a female prime minister, and I served in that government with a female prime minister, and I can only recommend it for everyone. And UNDP was one of those organizations that already had female leadership with Helen Clark. Before that, Achim Steiner took it over. So the selection is made by member states. Let's make sure that you have a broad basis out of which you can select.
The selection is made by member states, but really it's the P5 that decide, isn't it? And one of the P5 believes that DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, is a very bad thing. Trump has said it amounts to discrimination and discourages merit and leadership.
Well, I think this selection basis is excellence, experience, leadership, ambition. There is plenty of women in the world who have those qualities.
Thank you so much for joining us in your first interview here at the Doha Forum as the administrator of the UN Development Programme, Alexander De Croo.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Administrator De Croo. Thank you, James. As always, you get scoops, first interviews, and so on. But I won't be jealous. Thank you both so much. Time now for a final break, a coffee break, to help us refuel, recharge, and get our last caffeine fix of the day before we embark on our last session of the forum and on to our closing ceremony. We'll see you back here in about 10 minutes.
the essay and really get to a productive but also provocative discussion about the rise of sovereign wealth funds, of state champions, of industrial policy, and why that matters so much for geopolitics today. So let me just quickly reintroduce our panel so you can hear them properly. To my left, there's Dimal Yahya, the Secretary General of the Digital Cooperation Organization. To her left, Jared Cohen. He is President of Global Affairs at Goldman Sachs. And to his left, Borge Brende, the President and CEO of the World Economic Forum. Jared, I'm going to start with you. So just give us a quick lay of the land. What do you mean by instrumental capital, and how does it tie up sovereign wealth funds, state capital, state champions, and why is that so important today?
Thank you, Ravi, and thank you for publishing the essay as well. It's great to be here with dear friends. I think we have an annual tradition of speaking on a panel together for the last several years. Let me set the context a little bit, which is, as everybody in this room knows, the idea of lots of wealth in the Middle East is not new. The idea of wealthy sovereign wealth funds in the Middle East is not new. Kuwait was the first to create one in 1953. So the question is, why are we talking about a new wealth of nations now? Why do we feel we need a new term like instrumental capital to talk about how these countries are deploying resources? The reason is you have $14 trillion of sovereign capital spread across 170 different sovereign wealth funds in the world, and 5.6 trillion of that is concentrated in 4 countries, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Kuwait. In 2015, it was only 2.2 trillion, and by 2030, it's expected that $8.8 trillion of capital are going to be sprinkled throughout 4 countries, right? That's unprecedented in history. Now, what's interesting is even though the idea of sovereign wealth funds goes back to 1953, until the mid-2010s, it was kind of a relatively uninteresting story of passive investment. But when new leadership came to power in the 2010s in Qatar and Saudi Arabia, and to some extent the United Arab Emirates, these leaders brought with them a new set of ambitions to diversify economies, lead in science and technology, and deploy capital abroad in ways that aligned with geopolitical interests. The problem was the geopolitics were driving the economic interests of these countries, not the other way around, and the Middle East continued to be stuck in this war on terror international relations framework, and for lack of a better way of putting it, it was still a geopolitical jungle. Fast forward to COVID, and the geopolitical center of gravity shifts from the Middle East to Washington and Beijing, and all of a sudden that geopolitical brush is cleared. And that ushered in this new era that we describe as the era of instrumental capital. And what we mean by that is during the time from when these leaders came to power up until the present, the capabilities and the infrastructure for investing reached entirely new heights. And now what we see with the deployment of resources from each of these countries is, yes, there's an expectation of outsized economic returns, but when we talk about instrumental capital, we're talking about state-led funds that are being deployed with a dual mandate, to generate those outsized economic returns, but also to project state power in a way that's accretive to the domestic goals and the international goals of the leadership that runs the country. And this capital is long-term, it's patient, and is meant to be highly strategic for what these countries are trying to do.
That's a great overview. Borge, I'm going to ask you to pick up. Now, obviously, your hat is the World Economic Forum hat, but you were previously Norway's foreign minister, which has a very substantial sovereign wealth fund. Just in the spirit of trying to discern what is new here, can you give us a sense of how Norway's sovereign wealth fund is different from what we're seeing now with what Jared was describing in the Gulf countries and their wealth funds?
No, thank you. I'm very happy to do so. You know, the Norwegian sovereign wealth fund is only $2 trillion US. So but it's not insignificant. It's not insignificant. But let me first put it a little bit into context. What makes these sovereign wealth funds very interesting is that these countries have a lot of saved resources. While most of the countries now globally is more indebted than at any other time since 1945. So many countries now have as their biggest expenditure on the state budget is interest on their loans. including US, that is the largest economy in the world, 27% of the global GDP, 5% of the global population, but still uses most money on its state budget on interest rates. So these countries that have the sovereign wealth funds, they have decided with extraordinary revenues, many of them from oil and gas, have then decided to put it aside, invest, and then use the real interest in investing in their people or pensions for the future. The Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, as I said, around $2 trillion was really started to save money back only in 2000. Only in 2000. When I was trade and industry minister back then, every year we put all the revenues from the oil and gas sector into the Sovereign Wealth Fund. Big pressure among voters saying, oh, we should use this money now, we should invest in our people. But then there was consensus in Norway. Let's put it aside. And today, the largest revenue in the Norwegian state budget is the real interest of the Sovereign Wealth Fund. At the beginning, we were able to take out 4% of the real interest, but then it became too much money because we can't put that much money into the state budget too. So now we have capped it at 3% or 2.75. So what I would say for nations with extraordinary revenues, for example, from natural resources, it's a good thing to put it in the Sovereign Wealth Fund and then rather use the real interest. But the real interest then needs to be invested in future competitiveness. That is what is important in research and development, in infrastructure, things that then creates also future values in your country. So that's where the Norwegian story comes from.
That's great. Dima, this is a great time to bring you in. You have worked in the public sector and private sector in Saudi Arabia. You're a woman. Give us your sense of the importance of what sovereign wealth funds can do. And again, riffing off of what Jared said, this idea that it's patient, stable, long-term, but it's also projecting state power and building out capacities.
Oh, definitely. Thank you for bringing that up. You know, we see that especially now in the digital era that we are living in, it is transforming in a very exponential rate. Technology is not as available as it was before. The advancement of the technology is very fast, and therefore, for countries to diversify their economies and bet on digital economy, they need to transform as countries. But this is where the infrastructure comes in. Can the private sector take on such kind of building that infrastructure, either from submarine cables to cloud computing and the whole stack of that infrastructure? And this is where governments come to a point where, yes, we have to create stimulus business environments to support the private sector, but also governments need to invest in that infrastructure. And this is where sovereign funds come in investing in areas where private sector institutions lack that investment. I'll give you an example. We represent 16 member states. We did a study around these 16 member states, and we saw that around the 60 member states, we have 160 subcables. Amazing. You know, you would look at, wow, they're rich when it comes to connectivity. Actually, no. 15% of that number is reliable. The other is unreliable, either old technologies, which is submarine cables from copper, not fiber optics, or other that is not fit for the future of AI and quantum. So this is vulnerability that these countries will be facing. So from that, with that 16 countries, imagine that there is only one company within the 16 nations that does submarine cable maintenance. Now, who can create such kind of companies? Sovereign funds. And this is where we've been working with actually the sovereign funds of our member states, is how to invest in such kind of infrastructure to make sure the digital resilience and reliableness of the sustainability of the growth of their digital economies.
Jared, if we zoom out a bit from here, can you situate us a bit? So you've got the sovereign wealth funds, you've got, especially in the Gulf, the rise of all of this catalytic money, instrumental capital, as you put it. But at sort of a higher level, you've got this big competition between the United States and China, and the world is organizing itself around that. Talk a little bit about their models and how they're either taking advantage of this new money or that money itself is playing the two sides against each other.
Yeah, so when you talk about US and China in the context of sovereign wealth, it gets quite interesting. There's a historic piece of context here, which is so far we've been talking about sovereign wealth funds that have been funded based on revenues from commodities. But one of the things that's interesting about the sovereign wealth funds in China and in Singapore is those funds ended up being funded by virtue of trade surpluses and non-commodity revenues. And so that was kind of this interregnum area, but it was those sovereign wealth funds, again in Singapore and China, that were kind of early pioneers for strategically deploying their capital in ways that aligned with their geopolitical interests. And we're familiar with the Belt and Road Initiative with China and so forth, but we're also familiar with the enormous amount of state capital that they're deploying domestically. So I say that as just historic context. There's two features of US and China that I would mention. There's a lot of talk right now about the US sovereign wealth fund and so forth, and who knows where that will end up going. But the reason countries have sovereign wealth funds is because there's an absence of deep capital markets, right? So the US, having kind of the deepest capital markets in the entire world, hasn't really had a need for a sovereign wealth fund, whereas countries that lack the capital markets, like in China, but have 1.4 billion people, it served a very important function. Same in countries in the Middle East that have kind of more nascent capital markets and smaller economies and smaller populations. The sovereign wealth fund has allowed them to play at a really robust level, which we can come back to before. But the third dimension of this gets to not just we've talked about the concentration of wealth in 4 countries, but what we haven't talked about is why that wealth has been allowed to be so strategic and so up-leveled and so essential to everything that's playing out in the world, right? Like, as I mentioned before, wealth in this region is not new. The way in which that wealth is empowering the countries is, and it is a function of the fact that for the first time in history, America's 3rd largest trading partner is also its most formidable adversary. And that causes people to look at US and China as if this is a second Cold War. This is not a second Cold War. It resembles none of the attributes of the Cold War, except for the fact that you're talking about 2 large countries with 2 large militaries. The Soviet Union and the US were never economically intertwined in the way that the US and China are. What that means is, whether you call it a strategic competition or a competitive coexistence, neither the US nor China can gain the upper hand without relying on other countries. And what this has done is it's allowed a group of countries, like the 4 that I mentioned earlier, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, UAE, and Kuwait, to emerge as a sea of geopolitical swing states who have a differentiated amount of capital that they can deploy wherever they want without having to worry about the political or geopolitical backlash. They have a differentiated part of the supply chain. They're attractive for nearshoring, offshoring, and friendshoring, and each of them is led by an individual that has a global agenda independent of Washington and Beijing. So that geopolitical context, which has been fueled by sustained tension between the US and China, coupled with just the accumulation of wealth, plus the fact that since the advent of these sovereign wealth funds, the capabilities and the capacities and the investment know-how has really germinated, is part of why we're in a situation now where, just to give you a concrete number, to give you a sense of the scope and the scale, in the first 8 months of 2025, $56.3 billion of global deal flow was accounted for by sovereign wealth in these 4 countries. That's 40% of the global deal flow in just the first 8 months of 2025, which is extraordinary.
Wow. Borge, I wonder if as we talk about the growing salience of sovereign wealth funds, whether it's worth thinking a little bit about what that does to global order and equality within that order. So how concerned are you that we could be creating a winner-takes-all world, or at least a world in which the countries that cannot afford to be a part of that change are not geopolitical swing states, but are a layer or two below that? What happens there?
No, that's a really good question. I think we already saw with the platform economy that the big preferred platforms also became very strong companies. So it was already a little bit the winner takes it all. Then you can say today, though, with the new technologies, artificial intelligence being one, quantum, also a lot of the other ones, autonomous vehicles, all that, it could lead to a winner-take-it-all situation. Let me come back to that. The other thing that could come to a winner-takes-it-all is that if you accumulate a lot of capital, as some countries do, they will have huge influence through that capital, because there are other countries that are incredibly indebted. As I said, some countries are more indebted than at any other time since the Napoleonic Wars. We have to go that far back. So if you look at future potential bubbles and black swan or black swans, I would say probably the most challenging bubble that we would potentially face if we see low growth in the years to come would be the situation related to debt. There's of course a lot of talk about potential bubbles on AI, potential bubbles on crypto. You cannot exclude that, but I think that would be more adjustments. And we have had bubbles before that have burst, but you know, .com too, but we saw a lot of strong companies coming out of that, and in the market economy, it does happen once in a while that you have those bubbles, but I would be very worried about a debt bubble. So we have the AI and the huge investments there. Can that create only a winner takes it all? And with the capital, those that have capital compared to those that don't have capital, that can also lead to a winner takes it all. So what is my perspective? What do I think there? I do think the jury is still out on the new technologies, on AI. I think we know in the hardware phase, where you see trillions of US dollars invested in the new language models and all that. But there can be a moment later on where you go more into the software phase, where you also will have incredible smart people coming up with things that also does not necessarily need to come from the big companies. You know, who knew about ChatGPT 5 years ago? Today they're a very big company. If you look at the 10 largest companies in the world today, when it comes to market cap, many of them did not exist 25 years ago. So it's not like a priori given that the winner is necessarily the one that is big today. But of course they do have an amazing capital flow that they know can invest in AI instead of necessarily borrowing all the money to invest. They can use their running flow. So that makes it different. But of course, the countries with the large sovereign wealth funds are in a privileged position, but they also have chosen not to use the money but save it. And that is also to avoid the Dutch sickness. And then and my last point is, you have different categories of sovereign wealth fund. My country, Norway, has decided to invest the money instead of using it in a sovereign wealth fund and then use the real interest. But we have also decided that it's not a tool to promote Norwegian interest per se. So we're totally transparent about the investments. We own on average 1.75% of all globally listed companies, or Norway does. Then they are also saying, the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, that they only take 5% up to 5% in these companies to avoid a situation where it is seen as a political tool. That's a national decision, and we're very transparent. Go on the website and you can see all the investments. So that has been Norway's kind of policy related to that.
Dima, of course, not every sovereign wealth fund is as transparent as that. And I'm curious about your perspective in the region, and maybe specifically with Saudi Arabia. If you look at some of the big projects, Diriyah, Neom, there are concerns that they've spent a lot of money and they're having to scale back a little bit. What kinds of checks and balances within sovereign wealth funds do you see that inherently exist, and what are the corrections they need to be thinking about in the future?
Well, definitely, as Burgay mentioned, in every sovereign fund has its own strategies, either to invest outwards, inwards, where to use that interest as well. I do see, although I'm not an expert in that domain, but I know that PIF, which is the Public Investment Fund of Saudi, is working actually now on their strategy, and it's the time for the refresh. And I think that since Vision 2030 launched, the strategy of PIF was to invest nationally and internationally. Nationally being that vehicle that will create new economies that are linked to Vision 2030, like tourism, technology, sports, education, and of that sort, and also investing in projects that are infrastructure related, that will enable other private sectors and ventures to build on top of it. And I think the projects that you have mentioned were building blocks for such kind of projects. Definitely throughout the years we've seen the fruits of such kind of investment, either Giddiya, now it's open. This month we have seen the Red Sea also is open, and it delivered on its promise. A lot of other projects as well delivered their promise, and projects that have delivered their promise now is being analyzed to either accelerate or either to reduce or decrease the investment in. And I think that's something that every sovereign fund should go through, which is assessing their investments and seeing how to take that direction forward. But I do encourage now, looking at where we are as the Digital Cooperation Organization, collecting the intelligence and the data of what is the must-have for every country to be digitally economy sustainable, especially with the era of AI, and that increase in the divide, which we will see. $300 billion investment in AI last year. A handful of countries were able to be part of producing this technology, which means that more than half of the globe was not able to be a producer, but a consumer. And this is where the sovereign funds should be looking into areas where how can you capitalize on each other as countries and not work in silos. With this advancement of new technologies, when it comes to infrastructure, cooperation is essential. A competitive advantage in a country could be a solution for a challenge in another country. And this is where, let's highlight, like the Gulf, for instance, their competitive advantage, strategic location, capital, energy, cheapness of energy, and that could be capitalized on in countries that have the computing power and also that have the brain power. And this is where they can complement each other. I do expect to see in the future more collaboration within sovereign funds. We are working in the DCO on new agreements on how to create collective investments within the region together, especially in cloud computing and infrastructure like submarine cables. So a new model, I think, of cooperation between sovereign funds have to be put in place. for the sustainability of growth of these countries.
Jared, I'm wondering if you have a take on how to do that, but also as you think about that, I'm curious if we can overlay demographics on this whole issue, because you know, there was a time where demographics was destiny, and here you have the countries that are able to deploy large amounts of capital. Obviously, they have much smaller populations, and so this deployment of capital is able to diversify their sources of revenue, but then eventually maybe even attract new demographics.
So I think the demographics point is incredibly important and essential for understanding that the Middle East is not some monolithic blob that bleeds together as one kind of geopolitical sea of wealth. I think part of the thing that I find fascinating is everybody, you know, so many people in the business community today have woken up and realized the Middle East is important. People have been coming here since the advent of sovereign wealth funds for allocation into their funds, and that era of passive capital where you can come and just by showing up you differentiate and come away with money, that era has been over, not just for a short period of time, but really for quite some period of time. Part of what it means to have that era over is the Middle East. It's interesting. You look at you look at the region of the Middle East, and each of these countries is operating more as an independent country, punching way above its weight on the global stage, and certainly way above its population size. So when you try to understand what is the difference between what Saudi Arabia is trying to do with its wealth, what Qatar, Kuwait, and UAE are trying to do with their wealth, I think it's useful to view it through the lens of people. So if you view Saudi Arabia as a starting point, Saudi Arabia is unique in that it has more than 35 million people. And so differently than the other countries, it's absolutely essential that the deployment of that sovereign wealth leads to not just employment opportunities for the population, but really up-levels the human capital. As Dima will attest, you know, historically, Saudi Arabia has had a tradition of merchant families, and it's moving towards up-leveling a younger population into an era of entrepreneurship and thought leadership. And so many of the investments that are focused abroad now require bringing a knowledge economy into the country. So that's kind of what's unique about Saudi Arabia. Here in Qatar, you have some of the best infrastructure built in the entire world. It was built in the lead up to the World Cup. I like to say that the World Cup was the IPO for the modern country of Qatar. And now Qatar, as it sort of looks beyond the World Cup, is focused on how do you attract another 2.5 million people who are permanent residents who come with their families and live in Qatar from around the world. And you know, if you look at what Qatar is doing, they can't do what Saudi Arabia is doing because there's not 35 million people, so you can't just rely on the population you have. And they don't want to copy what they're seeing, you know, nearby in UAE. Some of the most recognizable brands in the world for Qatar are its national champions. You know, Qatar Airways, Qatar National Bank, Al Jazeera, Ooredoo, et cetera. If you're a brilliant person and you want to work for an airline, if you're given a job at Qatar Airways, you'll move your family to Doha to take that job at Qatar Airways. And if you look at some of the best human capital from outside of Qatar that's living and working here with their families, they're working for national champions. The challenge that Qatar has that they're trying to address is they don't have enough national champions to fill that out. And I think it's a very exciting opportunity for the country because you have ready-made infrastructure to be able to do that. It's a totally unique situation where the infrastructure is built in anticipation of germinating a whole ecosystem of national champions that can connect Qatar to the rest of the world. In the case of the UAE, they have such a first mover advantage. They're unique demographically in the sense that it's less about attracting foreigners to live in the country and more about not losing that first mover advantage of being the place where companies want to have their headquarters and where people want to live. And if you look at what they're doing, they're leaning into that first mover advantage to really aggressively try to pursue through a whole ecosystem of sovereign wealth funds, not just a single one, emerging as one of the world's, or if not the world's greatest sovereign investor. And then Kuwait is an interesting story because they were the first to have a sovereign wealth fund, as I mentioned before, but they stayed in the passive investment paradigm for quite some period of time. And it's only in the last couple of years that you've had a paradigmatic shift in Kuwait, where you have new leadership at the KIA, new leadership sitting on top of a lot of the different big allocators. But what's fascinating about Kuwait demographically is they're emphasizing building it all with Kuwaiti nationals. And you see that through a variety of policies now.
Borge, you have such a great vantage point in your role at WEF. I'm curious how, when you hear all of this, how do you think the rise of sovereign wealth funds, and I guess with it, the rise of the Gulf states, how is that changing geopolitics? I mean, we were talking the other day about how the lens through which many of us are seeing the world now is realism, rather than privileging values or anything else. There's been a shift. And I'm curious how you tie that together with the changes we see here, and whether that's a good thing, or how you sort of characterize what it does to global order.
So I choose to have a real political approach to that. The world is moving in a more multipolarish direction. We're not there yet, but that's a reality. And I think what economy has shown and globally is that we've been much more resilient than we thought maybe even a year ago. So we're much more optimistic now on the global economy than we were just 1 or 2 years ago, where we had a real concern that we could go into a period with all the geopolitical turmoil, all the tariffs, into a low growth decade. You know, in the 1970s, we had almost zero growth, and then it was also a lot of economic challenges. But we're seeing now is 3.2% economic growth this year. It's a little bit lower than the trend growth that was close to 4% for decades, but it's not too bad, and especially with the most complex geopolitical backdrop in decades. We're still trading, we're still seeing growth. That's good, and we do think that the paradigm shift that the new technologies do represent is maybe the new engine of growth. Like trade was the engine of growth for decades. Trade grew twice as much as the global growth and pulled global growth. I think we will see now the same with the new technologies. A year ago in Doha we discussed, was there going to be a hard landing, a soft landing in the US economy, and there's no landing. And why is that? $500 billion invested in AI this year. This is amount of money that is staggering, but I think we already see some productivity gains in the economy. So I'm more optimistic moving forward, provided that there are no major wars, there are no major bubbles related to sovereign debt. And of course, we have to avoid any kind of pandemic, so we have to, of course, collaborate to be better.
I mean, we already have wars, and there's an open debate about whether we're in a bubble.
That we cannot afford. I would say on the sovereign wealth funds, though, coming back to that, we have to also remember what the history is. The history was that one wanted to avoid the Dutch disease. So the Netherlands used so much of the gas money in the 70s that the inflation became higher, and they didn't really get that much out of the extraordinary gas revenues. Now they're doing well, and this is also my point. There are countries doing extremely well in the world without sovereign wealth funds too, but those that have extraordinary revenues have learned from the Netherlands and the Dutch disease in the 70s. They rather save the money and use the real interest. And over time, it has shown that equities is a good way of saving money. But we should not forget that every country has a responsibility to look after its own competitiveness. Look at Argentina. Maybe the richest country in the world in 1945, that took the Peronistas 10 years, and it was a lower middle income country. Look at South Korea, zero natural resources, at least close to zero natural resources, was on pair GDP with Kenya in 1960. Today, the GDP per capita in Kenya is in Korea is 32 times the one in Kenya. So I'm still, with all this talk about winner takes it all the talk about sovereign wealth funds, we will see nations that prosper also moving forward because of hard work, investments in education, investments in R&D, excellent courts, not corrupt politicians, great governance, hard work, and willingness to really address the very fundamental issues.
That's a really great point. Dima, just to pick up from there, you know, your last point about, you know, how it's important to invest in a way where you're cooperating and not just competing, but also in a way that keeps in mind inequality within countries. And, you know, for example, one of the members of DCO is Pakistan. And I'm curious how, on the ground, you're able to see policy-making shift outcomes when it comes to inequality, or if there are any cooperative mechanisms you're seeing that are working.
Well, I do see it. I'll go back to and build on what Borge mentioned, which is the intention. The intention of these countries and that positive attitude to prosperity that we see now in a lot of our member states. And that intention is opening the opportunity for them to change and to change that mindset of when we, for instance, when you mentioned Pakistan, we're running an initiative with WEF actually in Pakistan, which is driving digital FDI. And the essence of that is what are the reforms that they have to take in place as government for them to attract the right investments, and also what are the packages and incentives. And here is where the openness for such kind of an activity and also working on the reforms in just 18 months, that gives indication that the willingness to change and the willingness to bet on diversifying economies. 2 months ago, we celebrated in Islamabad actually attracting $700 million of investments in digital assets within Pakistan. Why? Is because we identified where the opportunity is and we connected to the right of the supply with the demand, and here's where we accelerated that aspiration. We're doing the same thing in Cyprus, Rwanda as well, and now in Oman. And we see in each country, it's a different landscape, a different competitive advantage, where if we double down on that, we bring it to the surface for the investors, then this is where we can bridge that communication gap between the private sector and the investors. We are working with development funds as well, because we noticed that with sovereign funds as well as with development funds, they are willing to invest in infrastructure if they know where the opportunity is and is it based on certain statistics and measurements. And this is where we came up with the Digital Economy Navigator that identifies the gaps. We provide that data for the sovereign funds and also for the development funds, and we have seen a 10% shift in the mindset of the way that the sovereign funds and development funds are working with governments to deploy development projects in digital infrastructure.
Jared, I'd be remiss if I didn't put to you that sometimes big bets can go dramatically wrong. What if we're in an AI bubble? What will that do to all of these different sovereign wealth funds that are at this point quite heavily invested in the AI ecosystem, and that will create winners and losers within this general group and class of winners? How do you see that playing out?
So look, we're in a really interesting situation right now that I would say is kind of off script from history, just because if you look at the AI ecosystem, it's unprecedented amounts of money that are being spent in all aspects of the value chain before we know what the use cases are that will justify the spend. I don't actually think if there's a bubble, it's going to be because people decide generative AI isn't important. I think if there's a bubble, it's going to be because we can't get to the use cases fast enough to keep up with the investment thesis, right? So that's where I see you have kind of a timeline problem. I think what's interesting is if you look at the 4 big sovereigns, I increasingly, when it comes to AI, I refer to them as the sovereign hyperscalers. And I do that because if you look at Silicon Valley, right, the big companies in Silicon Valley, the hyperscalers, they compete with each other, they partner with each other, and in doing both, they end up fueling the economy. If you look at everything that's happening in the AI space, the valuations have reached such a level, the spend has reached such a level, that's before you get into the cheap energy and power thesis, that's before you get into the ability to construct large amounts of infrastructure quickly and at scale, that's before you get into the flexible regulatory ecosystems that are required to do this in the right way. You add all of that together, and it's not surprising that you have 3 countries, to a lesser extent, Kuwait, deeply involved in every major transaction that's happening in the AI space, right? And so what's interesting about it is the sovereign wealth funds, again, guided by the political leadership that run the country that are pushing an AI thesis, they signal to the market which companies are undervalued or which companies are overvalued depending on where they participate at this stage. They signal whether or not, for instance, we should be focusing on the compute or on the shell and the core by virtue of where they deploy their capital. And so in a lot of respects, the crystal ball for what's to come in terms of investing in the AI ecosystem comes from the Middle East, but in doing so, the deployment of that capital also shapes the ecosystem itself. Look, like any sort of moment of excitement, there's always a risk of a bubble. To me, what feels different about this is we have, you have 5 hyperscalers in the US that have sovereign wealth funds of cash on their balance sheet. They can weather the storm. You have sovereign wealth funds in the Middle East that are deploying a substantial amount of the additional capital that's going into this, and that's before you get into Singapore and China and elsewhere. There's a lot to keep this going. And I think what's interesting about instrumental capital versus passive capital or even just kind of traditional active capital, instrumental capital has proven able to weather the turbulence of the market. And even in Saudi Arabia, to use as an example, people point a lot to projects being scaled back or delayed and so forth. That to me looks more like a recalibration than a pivot. And I go back to what I said at the beginning, this capital is patient, it's long term, and it is heavily aligned with the domestic and international objectives.
Fantastic. Well, you mentioned the clock. We're up against the clock as well, so I'm going to leave it there. Thank you, all of you, for joining us. Remember, you can also read the essay that Jared wrote in Foreign Policy. It's actually leading the website right now, so just go to foreignpolicy.com. You'll know where to find it. And thank you to our great panelists, Dima, Jared, Borge. Let's hear it for them, please.
Thank you, Ravi. Thank you to all your wonderful panelists for this insightful conversation. Nothing much more to add, except that we have 2 extra minutes for one final break, coffee break that we'll be taking now. But please do make sure to join us in a few minutes. And can I please ask those of you who are sitting in the front row to please leave your seats if you can as we rearrange the area just before we begin our final panel discussion, which will include Somalia's president, Yemen's vice president, and the United Nations Special Rapporteur, Francesca Albanese. Of course, it'll be followed by closing remarks by a very special guest this year, Her Highness Sheikh Hamoza. We'll see you back here in just a few minutes. Your Highness, Sheikh Hamoza bint Nasser, esteemed guests, ladies and gentlemen, and dear friends. As we approach the close of this year's Doha Forum, our final panel tackles one of the most consequential and defining issues of our time: the collapse of trust in governments and institutions. How can we rebuild it? Through shared action, collective commitments. Governments, corporations, media organizations, digital platforms, international institutions are all facing declining confidence. Many countries in the Middle East and in Africa have endured long histories of colonialism, resource extraction, exploitation, illegal military interventions, and brutal occupations. For decades, if not hundreds of years, there has been systemic, structural exploitation that has shaped today's inequalities. What does true justice, which is the theme of the Doha Forum this year, what does true justice for nations and peoples who have been scarred by these structural injustices look like? Should it be shaped by the countries themselves or imposed by external powers? It is my privilege to moderate this closing panel with our distinguished panelists. May I invite to join me here on stage His Excellency Hassan Sheikh Mohammed, President of the Federal Republic of Somalia, His Excellency Abdullah Al-Alimi Bawazir, Vice President of the Republic of Yemen, and last but not least, Francesca Albanese, the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the occupied Palestinian territories. Welcome to you all, and what a pleasure and a privilege to be sitting on stage here with you and to have Sheikh Hamoza with us in the audience as well. Let me begin with you, President Hassan Sheikh Mohammed. We talk about the issue of injustice and inequality, the loss of trust, but looking at Somalia's own history, briefly, one can say that it has been deeply shaped by foreign domination, colonialism. Its scars run very deep. It has been carved by colonial powers, the British, the French, the Italians, propped up by foreign backers as well, and left to struggle on its own, not just under the weight of decades of exploitation, but also decades of civil war, corruption, and security challenges. Let me ask you from your perspective, Mr. President, in Somalia, what are the key steps that you feel need to be taken to rebuild confidence and accountability?
Thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure and honor for me to be here. Very much grateful with the presence of Her Highness Sheikh Musa. Thank you very much for offering us this opportunity. The issue of the justice is one of the fundamental issues that are staying in the world globally today, and in Africa in particular. Most of us, we have inherited a colonial justice system that might not be transcendent to our way of life, our culture, our values, and our beliefs as well. So that's one. The culture, not only the articles and the laws that are in place, but the way those laws have been accepted by the people. If the justice system does not have acceptance from the people, however it's good, it's beautiful, it will not work. In line with that, if I take the case of Somalia, as you rightly said, we didn't even inherit one justice system. We inherited from the colonial powers different justice systems. But however, we united those systems, but again, it didn't work for us for some time. Now, what we do is that Somalia has become a federal government with a level of autonomy to the local administrations and management of the people. So we decided to take the justice close to the people, number one. The people must have access to the at the lowest, the farthest corner of the country everywhere. That is number one. Number two is whether the justice is based on the values. Somalia, the population of Somalia is 100% Muslims, Sunni Muslims, Shafi'i madhab, but even then, they have to see it, that the justice system responds or is in line with their value and their beliefs. That's why we have incorporated and aligned the values of the people. So the third point is how the people, the leadership of the country, or the leadership of a particular part of the country is so close to the people. If we took the style of the colonial powers where the colonial authorities were separate from the local people, now what's required is the leadership has to live with the people in the good days, in the difficult days, in the needy days, in the prosperity days, all this. So these are some of the fundamentals that I say that justice can be accepted and implemented in a fair way. Not only writing very, very good articles and laws only. Thank you.
So give us specifics about what kind of steps you and perhaps other African leaders are doing today to make sure that the future that you are building, the kind of justice that you do say you seek, is one that actually works for the youthful population of Africa and Somalia, a very rapidly growing population, half of the population under 25 years. And the same goes for the continent as a whole. 60% of the continent is under 25 years old, and it is the fastest growing population in the world. What are you doing to make sure that they can believe in the future?
As I said earlier, one important aspect is how to incorporate the laws of the country with the traditions and the values of the society. There are traditional laws that is not written, many of them not written, but accepted by the people. The justice system in that country has to reflect some of those traditional laws. Those traditional laws that cannot compete or follow with the modern way of life maybe can be reviewed or changed, but the people, what they believe, that's what I'm saying, the acceptance of the people is very important. And traditional laws are laws that has been accepted by the people. Many of them are not written even, but even then, again, from one generation to another. That's number one. Number two, the youth is to involve in the making of the laws. When a law is to be established, it has to take time, go to the people, explain to them what this law says, and get their input. That's how the people, particularly the young generation, feel that they are part, or they own the laws that are going to be implemented soon.
And too often they feel left out of the decision-making as well. Turning to the Vice President of Syria, Vice President of Yemen, Vice President Bawazir, we often forget that Yemen, after years of conflict, is still going through a war in many parts of the country. Given that conflict, displacement, continuing suffering on quite a large scale is going on after so much time, what for you does justice look like for Yemenis? To what extent can your government deliver in a way that rebuilds trust and dignity for the people who live in these war-torn areas?
شكرا جزيلا. أنا سعيد أن أحضر هذه الفعالية وبحضور الشيخ موسى في هذه الجلسة الختامية. فيما يتعلق باليمن، اليمن يمر بمرحلة صعبة، أكثر من 10 سنوات حرب. كان اليمنيين على أعتاب مرحلة جديدة في بناء دولتهم بعد حوار وطني شامل في العام 2012 و13 استمر لأشهر، ووضعوا تصور لبناء دولة يمنية مدنية حديثة قائمة على العدالة، قائمة على أن تكون هناك حكم رشيد وتوزيع عادل للسلطة والثروة، وبدأوا بوضع دستور جديد للبلاد. وقبل أن تنتهي هذه المرحلة حصل هناك انقلاب مسلح قادته الميليشيا الحوثية الإرهابية واستولت على الدولة وعلى مؤسسات الدولة وعلى جزء كبير من البلاد. العدالة للأسف الشديد أنها فقدت في هذه المرحلة، وخلال هذه الفترة 11 عام كانت لدينا محطات تفاوض وسلام، وللأسف الشديد لغياب الرؤية الشاملة والحل الشامل ولغياب الانطلاق نحو تأسيس سلام دائم شامل يقوم على معالجة جذور هذه المشكلة، للأسف لم نصل إلى هذه المحطة النهائية للسلام. بدأنا من بعد الحرب مباشرة في 2015 دورات تفاوض في سويسرا، في جنيف، في بيل، ثم في الكويت، ثم في ستوكهولم. كل هذه المحطات للأسف لأن لم نشخص جذور هذه المشكلة. انتقلت الحرب اليوم من صراع داخلي إلى صراع متعدد الأطراف، دخل فيها الجانب الطائفي والجانب السياسي والجانب الاقتصادي والبعد الإقليمي والبعد الدولي، وأصبح الحوثي اليوم مهدد إقليمي ودولي عابر للحدود. بهذا المستوى تشابكت فيه المشكلة وتعقدت وغابت فيه مفهوم العدالة. اليوم إذا أردنا أن نحقق للشعب اليمني عدالة حقيقية هو بأن ننظر إلى اليمن ليس كمهدد ولكن كفرصة حقيقية يمكن أن تتحول من مهدد أمني يهدد الإقليم والعالم إلى فرصة لبناء دولة حقيقية. اليمن بلد عظيم له تاريخ كبير ولديه تنوع جغرافي كبير ولديه كتلة بشرية شابة قادرة على أن تعمل، لديه سواحل كبيرة، لديه مقومات أن تكون وأن تتحول من تهديد إقليمي ودولي إلى فرصة حقيقية لبناء دولة كبيرة قائمة على عدل وعلى مساواة وعلى حكم رشيد وعلى توزيع عادل للسلطة والثروة. العالم اليوم ينبغي أن ينظر لليمن بمنظور مختلف، حتى يوم أن نقدم مقاربة سياسية ينبغي أن تكون مقاربة قائمة على استغلال هذا الملف لتحويله من ملف حرب وملف تحديد أمني وملف ما يسمى بعود الكبريت الذي يمكن أن ينفجر في أي لحظة إلى بلد قادرة أن تنمو وإلى أن تعيش وإلى أن تضع هذه الفئة الكبيرة من الكتلة البشرية في محل آمن. الأساس اليوم العدالة ينبغي أن تكون، لأنه بدون
Let me ask you, if I may interrupt, what this justice that you are thinking about, what it requires, to what extent does it require accountability, holding not just, as you mentioned, the internal local actors accountable for some of the crimes that have been committed over the last decade, but some of the external actors who've been fueling this ongoing war. Yemen is often referred to as one of the poorest countries in the world. Do you have the wherewithal to seek justice and accountability?
نحن في الحقيقة خطة العدالة اليوم تقوم أساساً أولاً على الانتصار للشعب من خلال تقديم خدمات نوعية لأبناء الشعب وخروجهم من مرحلة الحرب إلى مرحلة السلام. العدالة إذا أردنا اليوم أن نتحرك فيها فهي أن تنصب الجهود الإقليمية والدولية مع الجهود المحلية لوجود حل سياسي عادل يحمل اليمن من مرحلة الصراع إلى مرحلة السلام. أما ما يتعلق بعدالة المحاسبة، كل بلد تتعرض لحرب هناك أخطاء كبيرة ترتكب سواء داخلياً أو خارجياً. للأسف تحولت اليمن إلى ساحة صراع لقوى مختلفة. اليوم هناك تخادم للحوثيين. أنا أحيي الأخ الرئيس الصومالي بجنبي هنا. هناك تخادم للحوثيين مع جهات داخل الصومال، وأعتقد أنه الإخوة في الصومال يعانون، لأن هناك وتقرير الأمم المتحدة وفريق الخبراء أكد على أن هناك عمليات تنسيق لتهريب سلاح لتدريب مسلحين، وأصبح الحوثي تهديد عابر للحدود. العدالة تحتاج اليوم أي مرحلة قادمة تقوم على أولاً أن نؤسس لمرحلة جديدة في اليمن، تقوم على أن اليمن تعود إلى مرحلة القانون، تعود إلى حكم حقيقي يستند الناس فيه إلى مرجعية القانون بدون أن تكون عدالة انتقالية. واحدة من الملفات التي تم الاتفاق عليها في مؤتمر الحوار الشامل هي العدالة الانتقالية. هذه العدالة ينبغي أن تكون في مرحلة تسوية الحرب، واحدة من البنود التي يخضع الناس جميعا لها. كل من تسبب في مأساة اليمنيين، كل من تسبب في معاناة اليمنيين ينبغي أن يأخذ حقه العادل وفق القانون الإنساني والدولي في هذا الأمر.
Thank you, Vice President. Francesca Albanese, obviously we just heard the view from Africa and another part of Asia, but there is absolutely no shortage, is there, of inequalities, injustices from Africa to the Middle East, but specifically and perhaps nowhere more than in occupied Palestine, which is your mandate. It isn't just governments and political leaders who are either unable or unwilling to fulfill some of their legal and moral obligations. It's also major institutions like the United Nations, given the fact that it is the world's foremost peacekeeping body. It has failed repeatedly, as we all know, to secure a ceasefire for Gaza over 2 years. It was blocked by one permanent member at least 6 times. How do you deliver justice for Palestinians, given this reality, and would it require accountability, including from outside actors who have, for the past 2 years, either stood by silently or were complicit, actively fueling Israel's war machine?
Good afternoon, everyone. I would also like to extend my appreciation and gratitude to the Doha Forum, Excellencies, Sheikh Musa. I think that if there is a word that comes to my mind more than any other these days, is rapture, is apocalypse. I've often described the situation of Gaza, of Palestine, in fact, as apocalyptic, and I'll get back to it. But the question of rapture is harshly felt inside the international system. Those who behave, those who believe, those who advocate for the application of, and those who have to use international law as a compass to guide politics. And today they are confronted with the reality where the compass works. It's not international law that has a problem, it's politics. It's politics that has completely lost its moral compass. And is it new? No, it's not new. Palestine bears testament to all injustices that other parts of the world, like Somalia, Yemen, and many others of distinguished representatives who are here today speak to. What I think, and also the breaking of the trust into the political system, I'm equally horrified as a lawyer, as a special rapporteur, to see the United Nations, the organizations whose very existence is connected to the never again, to the crimes, to the horrible, abominable crimes that were committed during World War II, to make sure that we do not get there again, that never again is really respected, to preserve peace and stability, premised upon the respect of everyone's dignity and equality. I'm equally horrified, I was saying, to see that, yes, it took 2 years to arrive, to vote, to pass a resolution that included the ceasefire, but also the fact that now the ceasefire has been agreed upon. This is becoming the new tool for Israel to continue the genocide, to continue what the genocide didn't achieve, the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, the total crushing of the Palestinians' right to self-determination. And this is why I say this is a moment that calls for full introspection and realization of how are we making to repair that trust. Because the trust that is at the basis of the social contract that exists at the domestic level in democracies, but also at the international level in the United Nations, is under test today. If you see, for one thing, I'm proud to be a Western person, a European today, is not just because of the system of values premised upon the respect of international law, the rule of law, or equality before the law. No, it's the young people, the young generation, which in the West has been the first from the United States to Europe to Australia and other places, former colonies, former settler colonial endeavors. they have stood up against the genocide. They have been the first to protest, followed by the workers. And what they have been met with? Batons by the police, criminalizations by government, and other forms of repression in the cradle of democracies. So this is why I'm saying Palestine has been an awakening, a wake-up call for all of us. And I often speak, and this is the last remark I wanted to share, of the Palestine effect. This is not the first genocide in human history. This is at least the third genocide, if not the fourth or the fifth, that occurs in my my lifetime. This is the first genocide that awakens global conscience and global response. Palestine is allowing us to see what the law becomes when it's in the hands of power. Palestine is allowing us to see what connects all injustices, what happens to Yemen, to Sudan, to Congo, and including in places where poverty has not been so rooted as it is today for a long time, including in the West. We have a common enemy, and we need to face it, where the politics is at the service of economic interests.
But just to follow up briefly, Francesca, you mentioned that we have the laws, we have the conventions on genocide and everything else. It is the implementation that lacks. I wonder to what extent it is accurate to say that the world has lost its moral compass, or as you've just alluded to now, the genocide in Gaza has actually exposed the level of dishonesty, and let's face it, hypocrisy within the Western world particularly. So to that point, and another one that I want to ask you about very briefly before I move on to our other two speakers, you are the first UN Special Rapporteur to ever have been sanctioned by any state. The United States imposed sanctions on you for simply doing your job, for publishing reports that have taken on corporations and governments that you believe have been complicit in Israel's genocide in Gaza. You refuse to be intimidated. You and I had a conversation a few days ago. You say you will not be intimidated, but surely it must do something to the rule of law, and anyone willing to uphold it despite this campaign of intimidation and bullying.
Look,
does it?
What happens to me is what happens to anyone who stands in solidarity, not with the Palestinian people, with justice. Because today, the international, what the United States sanctioning me is telling to the international system is, we don't need you. And this is the culmination of a series of attacks, of a series of aggressions, a smear campaign. Everyone who's been trying to infuse an ounce of respect for international law in the context of the aggression on Gaza has been accused of anti-Semitism, supporting terrorism, from the Pope to the Secretary General, and of course, special rapporteurs among others. So I could speak to what has happened to me, and what I think is so pernicious of this is the tolerance. So you ask me why you do not, why do you continue? Why do you persist? Because what I'm left with is my dignity, and it's my voice. And while no member states have done what I think should be done, getting together, standing together, and standing up against the United States and tell, enough, this is a violation. This is the first UN person who's been sanctioned in 80 years of UN life, and it cannot constitute a precedent. It's illegal. It's against the UN Charter. It's against the Convention on Privileges and Immunities. And so, please, you have to withdraw the sanctions. No member state has done it. It doesn't speak to my courage. It speaks to the broad cowardice that exists in the international community, and I cannot be held accountable for that. But, there is a but. I will not be silenced till I will have breath in my lungs. I will continue to advocate for justice, not as a lawyer, not as the special rapporteur for the occupied Palestinian territory, but as a mother, as a mother who doesn't want that the brutality that has been unleashed day in and day out with the complacency and the complicity of so many governments, especially from the part of the world I come from, will become the rule. I cannot accept as a mother that this is normalized, and this is why I keep on saying we still have time. What we are using is not something we have inherited from our ancestors. It's something that we are borrowing, and let me be very honest, we are stealing from our children, and this is why I think let's take it as an opportunity to change.
Thank you very much, Francesca. President Hassan Sheikh Mohammed, just looking and reflecting on what we just heard, and speaking as an African leader who has seen for years the way the current world order, the Western-dominated rules-based order, uses our global institutions, our legal mechanisms as tools against the powerless. The Security Council of the United Nations to this day doesn't have a single African permanent member. How important is it to change this reality? The ICC, we know, has operated for years with a focus on African leaders. How do you view the current system, and what needs to happen? Can we carry on with this same system, or do we need some kind of overhaul, not to say revolution?
Well, the international or the global system of justice has been shown the weaknesses and the cracks it has already developed and working. The problem of the international law is that there is no watchman that you can call at any time that there is a violation. Proper implementation and enforcement is where we are losing. When the international crimes become intertwined with the interest of some other nations that are bigger in voice, bigger in power and in position, and they don't want to implement the international law, international law is there to protect the weak at the global level. Nations that have no bigger voice, nations that have no military capability to defend their interests, all these were the establishment, but unfortunately, it's not working that way, as she said. What has happened in Gaza was really a very good demonstration for the weakness of the international law that has happened.
So what needs to happen to change this? Because we are now seeing the emergence of smaller actors in the developing world, especially the global south, like South Africa and others, take on the big powers.
There is always a voice, and it's growing, that many of the international systems that were established or founded after the Second World War is not functioning or is not functioning properly. So review of all, including the major institutions like the United Nations, is now under discussion. The voice is there, but still there are obstacles on the way to do the necessary review for that. Somalia, being a non-permanent member of the United Nations Security Council right now, we are advocating for that purpose, and I believe that it's getting momentum. It's a matter of time before that happens. That is the international or the global order or system. If I go back to the countries, there are so many challenges in Somalia and countries like Somalia, post-conflict, fragile countries. This is the sort. But there are also opportunities in it to review the whole systems in place. So said earlier and said my colleagues as well, trust. However, the system is beautiful and good. If the people that this system serves does not believe it, does not have the trust on it, it doesn't work and it cannot work. So one of the main reasons is how can we make our people trust the system? As I said earlier, one of the things is that they need to feel ownership of the system. They should not see the system as imposed by higher authorities or by foreigners or by other interests. They need to feel that this is theirs, their contribution, their ideas, their worries, their wishes are there in it is very important. The second aspect is how can we make trust is earned. You cannot impose trust, or you cannot push trust. It's earned. You have to earn the trust. The system of justice has to earn the trust. And in order to earn, structurally, it has to be built. How far the system is independent from political interference. How far the system is structured and the people running the system are credible people. These are some of the important issues. How far the system advocates for equal distribution of resources and opportunities in that particular country. When these measures are there and when these measures are sold to the people, that it's true, then only so in Somalia now we're establishing structures that are independent from the politics, like independent judicial service commission that's independent from the other administration. We are serving also structures like Human Rights Commission, anti-money laundering status, anti-corruption. So these structures are voices, or structures where the people can go without going to the minister or to the parliamentarian or to directly someone who is free from all these influences. That's also the structural system of the justice system.
Of course, and they require not just people's participation, but transparency as well from the government. But talking about one fragile state and moving on to another, Yemen, again, Vice President Bawazir, not just looking at the structural changes that you need to do internally, but looking at the global system. Yemen being a very interesting case in point, a war that has gone on so many years with the Security Council standing by, violations happening probably on a daily basis. It's far away from the news. It's dropped off the radars. What needs to happen? How important is it for you that something fundamental changes in the international global system?
شكرا جزيلا. دعيني ابتداء أن أحيي السيدة فرانسيسكو على الموقف هذا وعلى ما اتخذته باتجاه القضية الفلسطينية وما تعرض له الشعب في غزة. ما يتعلق باليمن للأسف الشديد أنه استمرار الحرب لمدة 10 سنوات واحد من الأسباب يعود إلى أنه الأدوات الدولية كانت أضعف من أن تقف في وجه هذه الحرب. لدينا مجلس الأمن الدولي نزل إلى اليمن في 2013 وعقد اجتماع داخل اليمن يعزز التجربة اليمنية في الانتقال السلمي والسلس للسلطة. ثم بعد الانقلاب في 2014 أصدر مجلس الأمن الدولي قراراً برقم 2216 يحدد آلية إنهاء هذا الانقلاب. ثم بعد ذلك أصدر قراراً في 2015. للأسف الشديد هذه الأدوات الدولية فقدت فاعليتها في منع هذه الصراعات. لنا اليوم أكثر من 11 عام في هذه الحرب ولدينا قرارات ومرجعيات دولية ومرجعيات إقليمية ومرجعيات محلية، ومع هذا للأسف الشديد لم تساهم في إنهاء الصراع أو إنهاء الحرب. مجلس الأمن الدولي لدينا الآن مبعوث للأمم المتحدة خاص باليمن طيلة هذه الفترة وأشرف على عدد من جولات التفاوض، لكن هناك غياب لدور دولي فاعل حقيقي وجاد لإنهاء الصراع في اليمن. الآن في خلال العامين الماضية يوم أن تحول الصراع في اليمن إلى صراع خارج حدود اليمن وأصبح يؤثر على الأمن الإقليمي والدولي، على الملاحة البحرية، على حركة التجارة العالمية، بدأ العالم يفيق ويرى أن هناك قضية كبيرة في اليمن ينبغي أن تتحول الجهود باتجاه اليمن. اليوم نشهد تغير في الموقف الدولي فيما يتعلق بالموقف الأمريكي من تصنيف الحوثيين. نتكلم عن موقف أوروبي أكثر جدية، لكن الأدوات الدولية لا زالت غير فاعلة، وأصبحت المبعوث الأمم المتحدة للأسف الشديد في حالة ضعف كبير جدا، لأنه غير قادر على التعاطي مع جماعة منقلبة على الدولة لديها أجندة خارجية ولديها دعم إقليمي يساعدها على البقاء. هذا ما يتعلق بدور المجتمع الدولي في إنهاء هذه الحرب. الأصل الآن أن تكون هناك مقاربة إقليمية دولية محلية لإنهاء هذا الصراع بشكل جاد. شكرا جزيلا.
Thank you, Vice President. To you again, Francesca, if I may. You know, I'm reminded of something Noam Chomsky once said. He said that your rights correspond to your power and your wealth. Do you believe that is true in the Palestinian context, in the sense that the Palestinian people do not have much international support, not on a popular level, but with governments, because of their lack of power and wealth to a certain degree? As a European, do you think this is a turning point?
Yes, yes, I think it's a turning point. And also this is what is so interesting about the history of Palestine. I was recently in South Africa, where I realized something beautiful that surprised me. We tend to think as Nelson Mandela quite as a unique, and he was a very special man. But if you go to South Africa, you realize that Nelson Mandela couldn't have been born in any other country, in the sense that the South Africans have a strength that it's almost incomparable to anything I've seen. Why? Because this is a people that has really fought for centuries, and one of the most horrible forms of settler colonial domination, and which in the last 50 years of its life were known as apartheid. But Nelson Mandela was one of the most famous quotes of his is, South Africa, we will not be free until Palestine is free. What did he mean? Why didn't he say Somalia or Yemen or any other country? Because of something that linked South Africa and Palestine. It's the European settler colonial mentality that still underpins what Israel is doing to the Palestinian people, and especially in the occupied Palestinian territory. So do I see a moment of redemption? Absolutely. And it's in the power of the Palestinians, because they have not been defeated, they still, and I'm not talking of armed resistance, no, I'm talking of resilience. Sumud, which is the most defining value for the Palestinian people, has become a universal term. Thank you. This is for the Palestinians, I guess. People in Europe know what Sumud means, and its resilience and its steadfastness. And is it an opportunity for the governments? Yes. Yes, because we still need them. We still principle leadership. Leaders who put rights before profits. People in governments who are able to make sacrifices and act with dignity and integrity. There is always time, but time is not infinite. And so I do think that the word we need to pursue in order to reorient political conduct with the compass of the legal compass, what international law says, is justice. Can we stand all together for justice, for a world that is more just? Because this is what people are asking. They're standing against a place where might makes right. And in fact, the people of the world are getting united from Malaysia, Yemen, Somalia, South Africa, to all places on the world, not just the young people, the workers striking and civil servants breaking the ranks, demonstrating that you can be more civil than servants. This is the cusp of a revolution. The reason why I'm still hopeful is that the power of the Palestinians is intact. And today, Palestine doesn't just mean Sumud. Palestine is speaking the word and the verb and the grammar of justice.
Thank you very much, Francesca. In the remaining few minutes, if I can just go to each one of you, starting with you, President Hassan Sheikh, Mohammed. Just hearing what Francesca just said, the way Gaza, Palestine, has galvanized the entire world. To what extent do Somalians, I think it's almost a rhetorical question, feel that Gaza reflects their own struggles and the struggles of the entire world?
Well, the world has witnessed what has happened in Gaza, and I don't think that there is someone who can defend that in legal terms or in a moral compass terms as well. But as Francesca rightly said, that the Palestinian people are very resilient people, and they have been resisting for the last 70, 80 years. So it is not something that is new to them. I think it has tarnished the sense of justice and trust in the eyes of the world today. Many big voices or big powers in the world today has lost the moral compass to stand in front of the people and said, this is justice or this is injustice. I think the whole globe, the whole world, the international community as a global has a stand with the Palestinians. That's a proof that what has happened in Gaza has no morality in the human sense of morality. I think this will continue, and this will be a turning point for the international system of justice and international system of diplomacy as well. Yes, there's a lot of pain, a lot of grievance that the Palestinian community will ever remember, but once they get what they want, I hope that they will stand up with the rest of the world. And the world has shown that is what the United Nations Security Council reform is necessary. The system, I will not say the global system has collapsed, but it needs a review. And case example, very good case example is the Palestinian case right now. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, President Hassan Sheikh. Mohammed, to you, Vice President Bouwazir, your final thoughts on the situation in Gaza, the injustices faced by the Palestinian people, their struggle. How optimistic are you that this is a pivotal moment that has awakened the world and that will force change and justice?
في الحقيقة أنه ما تعرضت له غزة وما تعرض له فلسطين كان وصمة وعار في جبين العالم جميعاً. لكن دعيني هنا في هذه اللحظة أن أحيي الدور الرائد والكبير لدولة قطر والجهود الكبيرة التي قادتها مع إخوانهم في مصر ومع باقي الجهود في محاولة لرفع الظلم والضيم الذي تعرض له الشعب الفلسطيني. الذي حصل في غزة يندى له الجبين. هناك صمود عجيب وهناك درس للإنسانية جميعاً فيما يتعلق بصمود الفلسطينيين وتضحياتهم وصبرهم وحجم الألم والمعاناة التي تعرضوا لها كبير جداً. وللأسف كان امتحان صعب لكل المؤسسات الدولية ولكل الفاعلين الدوليين، بل أثبت أن هناك أو أن الضمير العالمي مر بمرحلة موت أو تعليق للحياة لفترة فيما يتعلق بالمرحلة التي عاشها الشعب الفلسطيني في غزة من ظروف صعبة. نتوقع أنه ونأمل رغم أنه لا زالت الجهود تمر في مرحلة حرجة، نأمل أن الشعب الفلسطيني يمر من هذه المرحلة إلى مرحلة أكثر استقرار وسلام. الشعب الفلسطيني يستحق أن يعيش كريماً عزيزاً على أرضه وتحت سماء بلاده. نتمنى أنه يحل الأمن والاستقرار والسلام في فلسطين وفي أرض غزة. وشكراً مرة أخرى للجهود التي بذلت من دولة قطر في هذا الشأن.
Thank you, Vice President Bouwazir. Francesca, I must end with you. You get the final thought. We've got 3.5 minutes. I know that you've been warning, haven't you, that we are misusing our resources, that we have a finite time on this earth, and that we must do more when we can. You said to me a few days ago that the mask has fallen and that without popular action, justice will not be delivered. So the question is, do you believe meaningful justice can still be achieved? And what must we all do, not just governments, but all of us?
Yes, so let me end on a, on a positive note. And this is not just to re-energize the discussion, but because I really believe that we can still make it better. and it's through justice. But first, let me take 1 minute to share a reflection that I hope will be a seed, will plant a seed of curiosity in you. Some scholars have written an article titled, "Palestine is a feminist issue." And this is so powerfully true. In the beginning, I was saying, no, what does it mean? I thought that it was referring to the fact that the feminist movement, especially in the West, had not been very close to the fate of the Palestinian. It's not that. It's about emancipation from oppressive structures of power that speak patriarchy. It's true at the domestic level, it's true at the international level. Because look at the way, for example, the International Criminal Court, Palestinian Human Rights Organization, a UN Special Rapporteur are being sanctioned. This is a slap in the face of the system. And it doesn't come from someone who respects the rules. It's someone who feels above the rules. And this is why I'm saying we need to break the system, not in a peaceful way. And we can. How do we do that? Through respecting the rules ourselves, first and foremost. And this is why the answer to your question, Rida, is justice. The International Court of Justice has already spoken. It has said that in order to end the violence in the case of Palestine, Israel must put an end to its unlawful occupation. It must withdraw the troops, dismantle the colonies, and stop exploiting Palestinian resources. What else do we need? The court has spoken. So let's follow this. Let's not impose further conditions of brutality on the Palestinians. At the moment, they are still being genocided. So this is a call for humanity and compassion. Justice goes through accountability, for sure, to international courts, through domestic courts, but first and foremost, it requires a change of mentality and a change of mind and a change of heart in every one of us. Change and peace is in every step. So let's make it happen as we leave this room today. Thank you.
A call to action. Thank you very much, Francesca Albanese, Vice President Bawazir, and President Mohammed. Thank you all very much indeed. And as I invite you to regain your seats, we will move straight into our closing ceremony here. As we come to the end of the official program of the 2025 Doha Forum, we are honored to have with us this year, for the first time, someone who has spent her entire life fighting for justice. She has done it both at home and in the wider region by empowering the younger generation and women through education. Here in Doha, it is not an exaggeration to say that her vision and determination have played a major role in establishing Qatar in its education, health, and research programs as an ecosystem. She has also helped provide education to children in many parts of the world, in conflict zones, in underprivileged environments, from Palestine to Sudan, from Syria to Lebanon to Iraq, in fact, to Haiti to Cambodia, to so many other places, including the DRC, and the list goes on. She is a visionary, a leader who does not wait for change to happen. She makes it happen. And she does that by providing the less fortunate among us with some of the tools that they need to empower themselves, by reminding us about the value and the importance of cultural identity, and by ensuring that change comes from within. It is my great pleasure and distinct honor to invite Her Highness Sheikh Moza, Chair of the Qatar Foundation and Education Above All, to deliver this year's closing remarks. Your Highness.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. السلام عليكم. عندما يكون سؤال العدالة موضوعاً للبحث تنهمر الأسئلة بكثافة حول صدقية التداول اللفظي للعدالة كاستحقاق، بينما تقوم الشواهد على غيابها في الواقع. فالعدالة في أصلها إيمان وثقافة وممارسة تتأصل في الواقع، والعدالة تحس وترى. ولن يكون الانخراط اللغوي والشعارات في محرابها بديلاً عنها بأي حال. تلك وعود غير مؤتمنة وتعهدات تصاغ لكي لا تنفذ. ويؤخذ على النظام العالمي غياب معايير العدالة، بينما تنتشر في الكرة الأرضية مشاهد ظلم لا يخفى، بل هو ظلم مسكوت عنه، وبتعبير أدق ظلم يتم تجاهله عن قصد. ففي زمن تحتدم فيه صراعات غير مسبوقة وتنهار فيه آليات الحوكمة، يصير الإخفاق في مواجهة سؤال العدالة نتيجة طبيعية، لأن لا أحد قادر على تقديم حلول فعالة لمواجهة التحديات التي تعصف المجتمع الإنساني. فالدول الكبرى بدلاً من أن تضمن حماية السلطة الولائية للعدالة لضبط ميزان العلاقات الدولية في مواقع العبث به، وبدلاً من صونها القانون الدولي أداة أممية لإحقاق العدالة، تنخرط هذه الدول في تكريس مصالحها وتمرير أجنداتها لبسط هيمنتها تحت مظلة نظام عالمي يشهد اضطراباً وتراجعاً مريعاً في معايير العدالة، وهي المعايير التي يفترض أن تحكم العلاقات والحقوق والفرص. حتى باتت العدالة مفهوماً نسبياً يتأثر بالظروف والمصالح، عوضاً عن أن تكون قيمة عالمية ثابتة. ولا أظن أن مفهوم العدالة يحتاج إلى إعادة تعريف، لأن القضية كلها متعلقة بكيفية تطبيق العدالة على أرض الواقع. وقد شهدنا في بقاع مختلفة من العالم تطبيقاً انتقائياً للحق في العدالة، وشهدنا كذلك تغييباً للحق في العدالة في مناطق تستصرخ شعوبها العالم لكف يد الظالم وإحقاق الحق، ولكن ما من مغيث. ولا نحتاج إلى شاهد عيان لإثبات وقاع الجرائم التي وثقتها شاشات التلفزة، بما فيها من تقتيل وحشي للمدنيين من مختلف الأعمار في غزة والسودان على سبيل المثال. ومع ذلك فإن صوت العدالة هو الأكثر خفوتاً في ضوضاء العالم. ذلك هو عالمنا اليوم. الحضور الكريم، من المهم الإشارة في هذا السياق إلى أن الحاجة للعدالة هي حاجة إنسانية شاملة، إنها الشرط اللازم لشعور الإنسان الضعيف بالحماية في وجه القوي، وهي بالقدر نفسه الشرط اللازم لصحة العلاقات الدولية، فلا تجور دولة بقوتها على أخرى. ولكم أن تتخيلوا أيها السيدات والسادة أي حيرة فكرية وأخلاقية يواجهها الشباب الذين تعلموا في مدارسهم وجامعاتهم أن العدالة شرط لعافية المجتمع الإنساني، ثم يرون بعد ذلك واقعاً من حولهم يناقض ما درسوا وتعلموه. ولهذا فلا عجب إذا امتلأت بهم الشوارع في حواضر العالم للاحتجاج على ممارسات القوة، مما اعتبروه خذلانا لكل المواثيق التي تمجد العدالة. إن البشرية اليوم بحاجة إلى إيلاء العدالة والعدل ما يستحقان من الصون والالتزام الصارم، وهي حاجة باتت ضرورية بسبب ما توافر الإنسان من أدوات القتل والإفناء الجماعي على نحو لم تعرفه البشرية من قبل، إذ لا شيء لا شيء يلجم سكرة القوة كما تفعل العدالة ويفعل القانون. الحضور الكريم، إن الواقع الإنساني اليوم يطرح قضية مثيرة حقاً، فحواها لماذا لا يصاحب التقدم التكنولوجي تقدم في مجال القيم؟ بكثير من التفكر والتأمل في قضية التقدم سنجد أنه من طرف خفي أصبح التقدم بأيدي القوى العظمى أداة من أدوات سحق الهويات والخصوصيات الثقافية. لذلك يجب أن لا ينسينا زهو التقدم فضيلة العدالة، فالقضاء على ثقافة إنسان وعلى هويته إنما هو قتل معنوي لا يقل عن قتله مادياً. في هذا السياق فمن العدالة احترام الخصوصية الثقافية ومراعاة حساسيتها المفرطة في بحثها عن الحماية في وجه التيارات العارمة للتقدم. فما يقال إنه تقدم في محيط ثقافي ما لا ينظر إليه كذلك من منظور ثقافي آخر، وما يصلح هنا لا يصلح هناك، وما ينبذ هنا يبجل هناك. وأنا أعتقد أن التقدم الحقيقي يتحقق جوهره بكونه رديفاً للعدالة، وإلا أصبح تقدماً عدمياً. ولأن التقدم كامل في التعليم، فمن العدالة أيضاً تحقيق الأمن التعليمي لضمان صون اللغة والتقاليد والهوية الثقافية، باعتبارها معاً مواريث وجدانية مبجلة وضامنة لسلامة المجتمعات وأمنها القومي. كذلك يصبح الأمن التعليمي شرطاً لتحقيق العدالة الاجتماعية، وسيكون إهماله انغماساً في الجهل والتخلف المفضيين إلى التبعية. السيدات والسادة، دعونا نفحص تجليات مفهوم العدالة، لأنه في حقيقة أمره لا يتخلف عن أي ضرب من ضروب الفعل الإنساني في هذه الحياة. إن تعزيز التماسك الأسري والاجتماعي عدالة، والرعاية الصحية وسلامة الطفل عدالة، وحماية التعليم وتحقيق أمنه عدالة، وتوفير فرص العمل الكريمة عدالة، حق الإنسان في التعبير عدالة. وهذه ركائز مرتبطة تتكامل لتشكل أساساً لعالم أكثر عدلاً. إن تحديات عالمنا اليوم تفرض علينا مقاربة جسورة تستعد ميزان العدالة المائل، فالعدالة بحضورها القوي تعيد للإنسان ثقته بنفسه، وللمهمشين وللذين يعيشون في ظروف صراع أو طوارئ إنسانية تعيد لهم إيمانهم بحقهم في الحياة وأنهم ليسوا عبئاً على العالم. الحضور الكريم، إن أهمية منتدى الدوحة تكمن في اجتماع القادة وصناع القرار للنظر مرة تلو أخرى في التحديات الممسكة بخناق العالم، وأكثرها من صنع الإنسان. لذلك فإن مقاربة الحلول ربما اقتضت شجاعة في طرح الأسئلة لاستعادة السلام في عالم آخذ في التوحش. ولا يكفي طرح الأسئلة لتحقيق الخلاص، بل يجب تقديم إجابات لا مراوغة فيها. وهنا ربما علينا أن نعيد طرح السؤال القديم الجديد: هل الحق هو الذي يؤسس القوة، قوة القانون والعدالة، أم أن القوة هي التي تؤسس حقها وعدلها بالعدوان والظلم؟ من المؤسف أن نرى اليوم واقعاً تحكمه سرديات معبرة عن مفاهيم القوة لشرعنة ما تعتبره حقاً وعدالة. وهذا يجعل المعركة اليوم معركة حول استعادة المعنى للمفاهيم التي أفرقت من دلالاتها، حتى أصبح السلام لا يعني السلام، والأمن لا يعني الأمن، والعدالة الضحية الكبرى لا تعني العدالة. ولذلك تكتسب جهودكم أيها الحضور الكريم أهمية كبرى لاهتمامكم بتحقيق العدالة وحماية معاييرها. آمل أن تجد مخرجات مؤتمركم هذا سبيلها إلى التأثير. فما أعظم الغاية وما أقل النصير وما أكبر الأمل في لحظة وعي تستحضر فيها الإنسانية عدالتها الغائبة. والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله.
A very fitting way to end the 2025 Doha Forum with Her Highness, reminding us about so many of the key principles, the prerequisites to our pursuit of justice, if we are indeed serious about making change happen. The need for courage, conviction, political will, and moral clarity. Thank you, Your Highness, for reminding us as well that at such a crucial time for humanity, when we are seeing unprecedented levels of suffering and injustice, that we can and indeed we must transform our public statements, our commitments and support for justice into concrete action, not slogans. So as we wrap the official program of the 2025 Doha Forum, and I remind everyone that there will still be many activities and panels still happening here tomorrow. We are indeed very grateful to all of you for the rich discussions and the valuable conversations we have shared from right around the globe here in Doha. As we thank you all for being here, we'd like to acknowledge a special member of the Doha Forum family, Her Excellency Lolwa Al Khater. She is the Minister of Education for the State of Qatar. She led the relaunch of the Doha Forum several years ago, setting it on a course to become the major global event that it is today. Thank you. Our gratitude also goes to Mubarak Al-Kuwari, the Executive Director of the Doha Forum, and Maha Al-Kuwari, the General Manager of the Doha Forum. They have both carried forward your vision and mapped the ambitious trajectory that the Doha Forum is currently on. Our thanks also go to the wider Doha Forum team. Thank you all for helping us make this event the success that it has been. Thank you for being here. Until we meet again next December, let us refuse to let justice remain a distant promise and work together to make it a lived reality, not just for some, but for people everywhere. Thank you all very much indeed.